Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at Psalm 9, the God who judges the nations. First of all, we have to note that Psalm 9 and Psalm 10 have them, at least in the Septuagint, that's the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. These appear as one united psalm. The same thing takes place in Jerome's Latin Vulgate, where again, Psalm 9 and 10 are connected. That actually throws off the numbers. If you're ever reading this through the Septuagint or comparing it with your English translation, be aware you might once you get past Psalm 9, you actually might be a chapter off. It leads to some humorous mistakes. This psalm contains a partial acrostic. An acrostic, for example, perhaps A is for apple, B is for banana, things like that. Um, where the first word of the psalm, once we get into the psalm, past the superscription, starts off with the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet, Aleph, and then Beth, Gimel, Daleth. Actually, there's no Daleth; it skips one. We'll get to that in a second. But that acrostic starts in Psalm 9 and goes all the way to the end of Psalm 10, which again suggests that this was originally one psalm. Now, it skips some letters. I just mentioned there's no letter Daleth. It skips the letter Daleth in Psalm 9, and then when we get to Psalm 10, it actually skips three letters, the Mem, the Nun, and the Sadi. So it skips some letters. Uh, been divided where at the end of Psalm 9, you have a Selah. Actually, this is the second time you've had one. And then you turn the page, and now you're into Psalm 10. So it might be that this was originally one psalm, and then at some time it was divided. It was a good place to divide after a Selah. And then Psalm 10, as you would expect, if there were originally one united psalm, it has no superscription. Now, the Hebrew scriptures have them separate, and because of that, I'm going to treat them separately, understanding they were probably originally united. Let's jump in then to the superscription for the choir director on Muth Laben. We're going to look at the Hebrew there. Um, Notice it actually says Almuth Laben. And the word on can be out, but in this case, and let me give you a English transliteration. In this case, if you look at the Hebrew, there's no dagish, there's no not dagish, there's no line between the two. It's all one word, which makes you wonder: are you supposed to take those first two letters and translate them as on? Those first two letters, they're actually part of the bigger word. So if you read this as Almuth, you might think at first glance this looks a lot like the Hebrew word for maidens. Notice the uth is plural. The problem is that notice that vav with the dot in the middle, that's known as a shurek, and that gives you the u sound. So you would say um, alamuth. But notice if you were saying in maidens, that would actually not be a shurek, it would be a holam vav, where that dagish would go over top of the vav. And that can make a difference in the change of the words. So uh, there have been a few translators that wanted to say, translate this phrase, referring to the maidens or the virgins is the same word that you had in Isaiah 7:14. But that dagish makes a difference, so that probably won't work. Now, some of the ways it's been treated in our translations, the Old King James Version does the same thing as our New American Standard. They say, we're not sure how to translate it, so we're just going to give you the Hebrew. But notice they put the upon, they took that al as a reference to upon muth laben, which is that a musical instrument? Is that a musical device? Is that some sort of tune or beat? Or they just left it in the Hebrew. The New English translation does something similar for the music director, according to, notice upon or according to is the same idea, Almuth Laban, the Almuth Laban style. So they think maybe it's a style of music. I think one of the most unique renditions, and it actually might be correct, is the New International Version for the director of music to the tune. That's what they're meaning by the al part. The death of the sun. And that word muth, if you take the first section as the preposition, muth actually is the regular word for death. And then Laben, you can actually take that one of two ways. Uh, to the Son, for the Son, or if you took it all as one word, remember your prepositions are always connected when they're separate like that. That's actually the word white. So a white death, I'm not sure that really fits. I think maybe the New International Version actually has it correct. Let's jump now. Once we've passed the superscription, let's jump into the psalm itself. I will give thanks to the Lord with all my heart. This is opening praise, as you can hear it. I will give thanks to the Lord. And of course, he actually says, Ani, I will give thanks. And when he does this, this is the letter Aleph. So I'm going to put the Hebrew letter, if it begins with the next in as part of our acrostic, I'm just going to put the Hebrew letter up there just to note this is part of that acrostic. Now, it's not going to be every line or even every verse, but he starts off, I will give thanks to the Lord with all my heart. Notice he's praising the Lord. I will tell, and again, we have the I will tell of all your wonders. I will be glad and exalt in you. I will sing praises to your name, O Most High. And we actually had two verses, each that started with an Aleph. So our acrostic is off and running. We come to verse 3. Now the acrostic is going to change to the letter Beit, and I'm not going to go into each Hebrew word that starts that off, but the first line in that verse starts with the letter Beit. We would say ABC. They would say Aleph Beth Gimel. There is no letter C in Hebrew. And so he continues, giving praise for God's righteous justice. When my enemies turn back, they stumble and perish before you. For you have maintained my just cause. You have sat on the throne, judging righteously. So notice, it's not just God took care of my enemies and people don't like me, but rather this is a just cause. So the psalmist um, sees himself, look, I've been doing rightly, and my enemies aren't just my enemies, they're enemies of that which is right. In other words, they're enemies of God. And so God has been judging righteously. He has been doing righteous justice, and the psalmist is glad for that. Verse 5, you have rebuked the nations. Notice we've gone now to Gimel, so Aleph Beth Gimel. You have rebuked the nations, you have destroyed the wicked, and God is seen here judging, first rebuking, destroying. You have blotted out their name forever and ever. There's three different ways of describing essentially the same thing. Um, Verse 6, the enemy has come to an end in perpetual ruins. You know, this is a judgment that has lasting repercussions, and you have uprooted the cities. The very memory of them has perished. And as we got into verse 6, we came to the next letter of our acrostic, except that we skipped a letter. We skipped the letter Daleth. I'm not sure exactly why that happened. Maybe they couldn't. The writer could not think of a letter to fit, and so he just skips a line. Verse 7, but the Lord abides forever. We've now come to Vav, and Vav is usually the word for either and or but, and so notice you're going to have a few of them in this verse, the next one, and the one after. But the Lord abides forever. And again, this is speaking of God's judgment on the nations. He has established his throne for judgment, and he will judge the world in righteousness. He will execute judgment for the peoples with equity. So his judgment, notice, we begin with the statement that God abides forever. You know, he's not just here today and gone tomorrow. And not only does he abide forever, he has established his throne for judgment. So his judgment will also have long range repercussions. He will judge the world in righteousness. I think that's looking not just for the present, but for the future. And he will execute judgment for the peoples with equity. Everything will balance in the end. The books will balance. God's judgment will rule at the end. As we come to verses 9 and 10, we've got two more vavs. Notice the word and we haven't even translated it that way in verse 9. So we should say, and the Lord also will be a stronghold. Notice God is being pictured here as a protector of the weak, a stronghold for the oppressed, a stronghold in times of trouble. That word stronghold, notice how it's repeated twice. That's the Hebrew miskav, literally a high place. Stronghold works because when a place is high, it's lifted up. You have to. It's almost like a high place serves as its own walls. You have to climb the walls and then maybe get to or climb the hill on which it is, and then climb the walls that are beyond that. And the Lord is pictured like that. He's a high place, a stronghold, a place of protection, a place of security. And those who know your name, verse 10, will put their trust in you. For you, O Lord, have not forsaken those who seek you. And so God, He protects those who are oppressed, the weak, the downtrodden. He is seen as their protector. Verse 11, sing praises. Notice we still have the same picture here. Sing praises, and we have now gone to the letter Zan in our acrostic. Sing praises to the Lord who dwells in Zion. Zion, of course, I don't think we've mentioned this in the Psalms yet. Zion was one of the hills on which the city of Jerusalem, there's several hills there, and eventually the term is that's the name of one of the hills, but eventually the term Zion came to be used for the entire city of Jerusalem, and that seems to be the way it's used here. Sing praises of the Lord who dwells in Zion, declare among the peoples his deeds, for he who requires blood remembers them. Now, when it's talking about he who requires blood, that's sort of a blood vengeance. In other words, you mistreated God's people, he's coming after you. He who requires blood remembers them. He does not forget the cry of the afflicted. Now, notice he remembers them, does not forget. So that's saying the same thing. He who requires blood, he does not forget. And the reason he requires blood is because they were afflicted. It's not requiring blood of them, but of the ones that did the afflicting. Verse 13, be gracious to me, O Lord. We've now moved to the chat and is continuing through our acrostic. Be gracious to me, O Lord. See my affliction from those who hate me, you who lift me up from the gates of death. And so now we have the call, be gracious. See my affliction from those who hate me, you who lift me up from the gates of death. And this is the supplication. And then he gives the reason and the result of that supplication. Notice he says, that I may tell of all your praises. I want you to be gracious. I want you to lift me up. I want you to rescue me so that I can praise you. That in the gates of the city, the gates of the daughter of Zion, I may rejoice in your salvation. Do this, save me, so that I can tell how you saved me, so I can glorify you. Do it not just for my sake, but for your sake, O God, that in the gates of the daughter of Zion I may rejoice in your salvation, and you will receive glory and honor from the work that you accomplish on my behalf. Verse 15, the nations have sunk down in the pit. We now move to the tat as in our acrostic. The nations have sunk down in the pit which they have made, in the net which they hid. Now notice, this is the application of God's judgment, where he's the one who's judged. He has done this. It's seen as already having taken place. And the nations sink down, not just at the hand of God's judgment, but in the pit which they have made. So that the nations, as they are judged, the judgment by which they are judged isn't a big hand coming down from heaven, but rather they fall in the very trap that they laid, the pit which they have made, in the net in which they hid. They set forth a net to capture somebody else, and they get themselves entangled in it. Their own foot has been caught. And in such a way, the Lord has made himself known. He has executed judgment in the work of his own hand. The wicked is snared. So that God caused it, but he caused the nations to trap themselves. He caused the nations to fall in their own pit. And then notice the Selah, but you actually have a Higion Selah. Now, Selah is, we said it's either a climactic pause, a crescendo or a pause, but a Higion, that's the idea of a meditating pause. That works nicely. Verse 17, our psalm continues, and now we come to the Yod part of our acrostic. The wicked will return to Sheol. Sheol is the Hebrew term, the grave, but it's a little bit more nuanced than that, and that's why our translators gave us the Hebrew instead of translating it, because you have not just a hole in the ground as the grave, but the realm of the dead. It's sort of a bit more nuanced than that, and sort of a shadowy idea. They didn't really know exactly what that, but it wasn't a good place to be. Nobody, um, nobody wants to be in the grave. The idea there's a common. Actually, it was an old song. I think everyone wants to go to heaven, but no one wants to die. And I think that's the idea behind Sheol. So the wicked will return to Sheol, even all the nations who forget God. And then verse 18 is our Kof. This is the last point of our acrostic before we go to Psalm 10. For the needy will not always be forgotten, nor the hope of the afflicted perish forever. And so we see here the destiny of the afflictors as well as the afflicted. For the afflictors, they're going to return to Sheol, all those people that don't take God into account. But the needy, those who have been afflicted, they will be delivered. They won't be always forgotten. Sometimes they seem to be. Sometimes they seem to be overlooked and left behind, but God has not overlooked or left them behind. So you have the wicked, the nations, and by contrast, the needy who have not been forgotten. The needy and the afflicted are talking about those that God rescues. Verses 19 and 20, arise, O Lord, do not let man prevail. Let the nations be judged before you. Put them in fear, O Lord. And notice how we have a repetition of these two ideas, although in opposite order. Now we read, let the nations know that they are but men. Of course, the nations, that's the Hagoim. But the word for man here, there's several different Hebrew words for man. I think we've noted this in a past lecture. For example, you have ish, which would be masculine. This is enosh. Enosh is the idea of maybe mortality. And notice you had it man singular, man plural, but it's actually both. They're both singular here in the Hebrew. I think the translators did that because it's referring to the nations. And so they're trying to be grammatically correct in English, but it doesn't necessarily have to be that in Hebrew. Now, Psalm 8, back when we were looking at Psalm 8, made a reference to mankind. You have made him a little lower than the angels, or the Septuagint said, or our Hebrew said, you have made him a little lower than God. Here in Psalm 9, let the nations know that they are but mankind. In other words, they're not God. They're less than him. And so, whereas Psalm 8 looks at this exaltation of mankind, Psalm 9 says, but don't get too exalted. Um, because you have God over you, and you must answer to him. Of course, the place where this meets is in the person of Jesus, who for a time was made a little lower than, well, Hebrews says a little lower than the angels in the book of Hebrews. But if we connect this to Psalm 8, we could even say a little lower than God. And yet he became mankind so that he could go to the cross, die in our place, and that he could provide salvation to the nations. He became a man and now sends us to make disciples of the nations so that they might know not only that they are mankind, but they might know the one who became man on their behalf, that we might be reconnected to God himself.